Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a crossing situation, the Erie Canal at the Schoharie Creek. I'm David Brooks, the educator at Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site in Fort Hunter, Montgomery County, New York. Thank you very much for having me for the Jervis Library event celebrating 125 years. This is a mashup of two programs that I typically will do as an outreach or online called Damn That Creek and the Otis Eddy Aqueduct. So hopefully we'll take this journey together. You'll find a few interesting facts and enjoy yourself along the way. First, let's talk about Schoharie Crossing. If you aren't aware, if you haven't been there, it's a wonderful New York State historic site and park in which you can come explore the remains and national landmark of the Erie Canal. It's also adjacent to today's modern barge canal. And what we need to look at when it comes to Schoharie Crossing is its origin. There are the three major phases of the Erie Canal that are represented and have evidence in historical land features at the site. But in the 1940s into the 1950s, the Fort Hunter Canal Society petitioned New York State and also worked to get the national landmark status. By 1966, Governor Rockefeller had established it as a New York State historic site, and the remains, particularly of the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct, which we are mostly well known for, became a national landmark structure. So we're going to be talking about the Erie Canal as it leads up to the Schoharie Creek, and then how it crosses over the Schoharie Creek, and how that has some direct connections to John B. Jervis, the namesake of the library there in Rome, New York. But we need to talk first about the Blue Line and the survey of the original Erie Canal. In 1816, Charles Brodhead was assigned a survey from Rome to the Schoharie Creek. It was an already established region of settlement and commerce. It had been traversed by turnpike roads as well as by use of the Mohawk River since even before European settlement in the area, but particularly in a post-American Revolution early republic. And John B. Jervis was in charge of engineering on a section of that from the Noses to Amsterdam, what would wind up becoming Port Jackson, the south side of Amsterdam today. He was overseen by Chief Engineer Benjamin Wright and the Canal Commissioner of Henry Seymour. And if you're not quite familiar, if you've ever driven through on New York State 5S, and New York State Thruway across New York, the noses are prominent features, particularly in the Yost Breakers area along the Mohawk River, where those two prominent edges of the mountain range descend into the Mohawk Valley, creating the most narrowest gap and the only real gap in the Appalachian mountain chain that extends from Georgia up into Maine, and particularly the reason why the Erie Canal would be such a success and why it only made sense for New York to create the canal because of its geological advantage. I know there's a lot of other early states that were looking to build canals to open up the interior for commerce, but the Mohawk Valley had that natural gap that they could exploit and create the Erie Canal. One of the issues with that survey was what was going to happen at the Schoharie Creek. This is an early map showing this creek that flows actually from the south toward the north and feeds into the Mohawk River. It's a 90-mile creek and a major watershed for the Catskill Mountains. It's a flood-prone area all along the Mohawk River. It really is a flood-prone area with the curves and oxbows in rivers and creeks along the way. But the Schoharie Creek was to be used as a primary source for about 50 miles. It needed to provide water to the canal. Canal without water is essentially just going to be a ditch. But crossing that would need the employment of a slack water dam, something to calm the water and also raise the water level up for the barges to cross through. And that would happen here, along where there was a former military road and portage area near Fort Hunter and Queen Anne's Chapel. So in order to dam that creek, they needed to put out a contract. So the Erie Canal, being constructed between 1817 and 1825, was put out by contract for each section, some sections being as short as a few hundred feet, some sections being several miles. So the surveyors had outlined where the canal is going to go, what features, where the locks would need to be, where dams would need to be, and culverts would need to be, and then would release that as bids for contract to local contractors, and eventually companies and larger contractors would come in as the work progressed to be awarded those contracts. But Colonel John Littlejohn Jr. was awarded contract number 353. There he is right there, Colonel Littlejohn. He was born in 1790 in Massachusetts and fought in the War of 1812. He married Eleanor Newkirk Littlejohn, or Eleanor Newkirk at the time, in 1823, and later would work as a principal builder on the Albany and Schenectady Inclined Plane Railroad. He'd become one of the builders on the Baltimore and Oriole Railroad, as well as canal projects along the James River. Let's keep in mind, let's keep a note of Eleanor Newkirk. John Littlejohn, here's documents from the Canal Commission Fund, his contract 353, would not only build the dam across Schoharie Creek in 1822 for the purpose of the Erie Canal, because actually leading up to this point, as you recall, Jervis had done a survey from Rome to the Schoharie Creek, but there weren't any formal plans what was going to happen after that. Going toward the east, toward Albany, there weren't definitive plans yet set as of 1822. So the dam is going to be created, creating a slackwater dam across the Schoharie Creek that's going to be used for navigation of barges during this early canal era. Constructed between 1821 to 1822, operated the dam and the scow and the ferry at that location. John Littlejohn was paid for that work, not only in creating the dam, but also the operation afterwards. Each section of the canal, as it was being completed, could open up to allow transportation of goods and other products on that section. That's actually one of the ways where they could start employing tolls and help fund the continual construction of the canal that would eventually cost about $7 million and take about 8 years to build. Abraham Newkirk replaces Littlejohn as the dam and lock operator after 1823. And if that last name sounds familiar, it should. Abraham Newkirk is the father of Littlejohn's wife. So he takes over the operation at the Schoharie Creek of operating Lock 19, as well as the East Guard Lock and the windlass ferry system in which the barges were pulled or ferried across the slackwater dam that was created in the Schoharie Creek. The total cost of the dam and services that were paid out to Littlejohn, about $17,000. It's roughly $423,000 today. In 1822, that was an 8-foot dam. It was 650 feet long, created with timber that was set on piles and filled and cribbed with stone, anchored at the wings with that stone masonry. And its first use lasted about 10 years. Again, its first use, 10 years. The second use, 12 years. We'll get into that in just a few moments. When completed, it was stated, it is a work of considerable magnitude across a stream which at times sweeps away almost every opposing obstacle. This is, however, a substantial work, and as it has an elevation of only 8 feet, it is believed to be capable of resisting the force of the greatest floods. One of the things that I mention when people come to tours at the site is that the Schoharie Creek at times will look very calm and peaceful and can be really low in its water levels and seem like very much the creek, and at other times a raging river. The Schoharie has the tendency to eat dams, it has a tendency to eat bridges, and has some very impressive freshnets in the spring and ice flow. The original dam washed out by 1832 with March floods, April floods, and the need for additional repairs during the summer, during navigation season in July of 1832. They knew that a new dam was going to need to be built because those continuous repairs were an annual event costing the state thousands of dollars. And in 1845, another service of the dam would be part of the feeder system as the aqueduct opens. So because the canal was such a success in the first couple of decades, there needs to be an enlargement. So the original canal is going to be enlarged between 1836 and 1862. And we're going to speak a little bit later about the aqueduct, but between 1839 and 1841, the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct is built, partly by the design of John B. Jervis, who at that point in time has gone on even more as an engineer. By 1845, the aqueduct goes into service. The dams in the Schoharie Creek are still required as part of a feeder system to supply water. Again, if you recall, that is a 50-mile line to Albany, that the Schoharie is going to be a dominant source of water as you go toward Albany, and will have to lock through around Cohoes Falls. 1849, those additional works and the 1850 floods entirely destroy the dam across the Schoharie Creek. And in 1822, the 1822 dam is put back into service at this point in time, and again lasts about 12 years after it is rehabbed. It is determined by 1862 that a concrete, stone, masonry, and timber dam is going to be required. It costs about $22,000. It comes out to over $500,000 today. Being 450 feet and 8 foot high, it lasts about 2 months before it's washed out. There's repairs, it's patched, and it's kept in service. But by 1864, they're going to need a much larger dam. They're going to reconstruct this yet again with an 11 foot high, 400 foot long tree dam, using more than 1,400 trees that are at least 70 to 90 feet tall, 18 to 22 inch diameter at the butts. That's at a cost of an additional $44,500, a cool $750,000 today. And again, this is just a couple of years after having already spent about $500,000 on a dam across the Schoharie Creek to provide water as a feeder to the rest of the canal system going east toward Albany. The flood damages are apparent throughout, but they are repaired, and that lasts until the early 20th century. That's sort of the last final version of the dam across the Schoharie Creek for the purpose of the Erie Canal. And this illustrates those versions of that. You can see that labeled number 1 is a stone and timber dam. That's the one that was used for the first 10 years and then rebuilt in the 1850. Dam number 2, that version a little bit to the left on your screen. Dam number 3, when they're building that one, it actually is going to be cutting across the path of Clinton's Ditch. At that point in time, Clinton's Ditch is no longer being used, the original Erie Canal going through the Schoharie Creek. So they can move that up. You don't have to worry about barges going through across that rope ferry because, as you can see, the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct is in use at that time. And that last version of the dam, the tree dam of 1864, kind of settles in the middle of the original dam and the third version of the dam. And that's actually the one that you can see the most today when the water levels are low. There are remnants of that dam, large stones coming across the creek, and actually some of the timbers left. With super low water, which we've been experiencing this year in the creek due to the operation of the canal in the eastern section not opening quite yet, that there are actually some remnants of the original dam and that second version, the 1832 version, that you can see along in the depths that otherwise would be under several feet of water. And this illustrates sort of how that last version of the dam was laid out with its stone cribbing, and how the timbers are laid up with the butts facing upstream and then packed in amounts of stone to try to hold them in place. And since there aren't images from that early 1820s dam, I'm going to use a couple of these images from the 1864 version to kind of show you how those dams looked across the Schoharie Creek. The center picture being the engineer. The top image shows a view toward the north, so going upstream of the Schoharie Creek, and that's the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct in 1864. And at the bottom image is a look toward the south, the low water in the creek at that point in time. This is work that has to be done when it's cold, There's not a lot of water flow in the creek. Again, that's looking toward the south. And if you've driven on the New York State Thruway and crossed over the Schoharie Creek, that higher elevation that you see is actually the location in which the Thruway Bridge will cross over the Schoharie Creek. And here is a better image of that lower part there that's showing that 11-foot high 1864 dam across the Schoharie Creek with some of the work scouts in the background, the engineers and politicians standing atop it. And here's another image of those fine young gentlemen with their high hats and coats, standing proudly as engineers and politicians on that 1864 dam. So what happens with Colonel John Littlejohn? Again, he goes on and becomes prosperous in other mill activities as he's moved out to Allegheny County in Michigan around 1840. He retires, probably due to some health concerns that may be a result of his war service in the War of 1812, and he dies during a visit to Omaha in 1868. There are some remnants of those dams, as I mentioned before. This is an earlier image, circa about 1900, showing the dam across the Schoharie Creek. The center building is a barn that burned down in 1969, but if you look to the right, that is a farmhouse that is currently today's Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site Visitor Center. You'd be able to come and check out an exhibit when we were open up called Pathway to Empire. So again, in the creek, there are remnants of these dams, particularly when the water level is low enough. There's a attempted a panoramic image from a few weeks back when the water levels were higher in the creek, showing the rifts that you can see due to the 1864 dam. Again, when the water level is being lower now, it's a little bit more easy to see some of that remnants. But let's talk about Otis Eddy's Aqueduct. Like I said, this is going to be a mashup of these two programs, and I will touch a little bit more on Jervis in just a few moments. We're going to do a quick recap. The Erie Canal opening in 1825 being an immediate success leads to enlargements. So we already talked about the original crossing and the need for that dam across the Schoharie Creek. So the improvements to the system, they need a bigger canal, bigger locks, and that enlargement period is going to last from 1836 to 1862 in the middle of the American Civil War. And part of that enlargement, they realized the Schoharie Creek, because of that dam causing so many problems, because of Schoharie Creek being so unable to be tamed, and the fact that after a heavy rainstorm, that crossing of the Schoharie Creek would actually need to be closed, and at times for several days, causing traffic jams east and west across the creek. The ideal situation would be to put the canal over the creek. They actually had that idea very early on in the 1820s as part of Jervis's survey and a few other debates that had been occurring. The issue having been the length that aqueduct need to be, the cost of the aqueduct, and just the glacial till that is in the bottom of the Schoharie Creek being very difficult to kind of manage in placing an aqueduct, particularly at that alignment that they wanted to put the canal through. There was already a bridge across the Schoharie Creek that could be utilized. It wasn't really successfully utilized for the canal. Oftentimes, travelers crossing the creek would have to use that windlass ferry system or a scow to pull them across the Schoharie Creek and not make use of the bridge as a towpath. The bridge would be eaten out or scour from its piers or otherwise dilapidated, and it was a pedestrian toll bridge essentially. So they already had thought about putting an aqueduct there. It wasn't feasible at the time. They deal for a few decades with the headaches of the Schoharie Creek, but by the 1830s, they are realizing that yes, we need to put an aqueduct in, and that needs to be designed. One of the designers of the aqueduct is John B. Jervis. And just to recap that, as it may be of great interest to this audience, is that Jervis had lived from 1795 to 1885. While being born on Long Island, his family, at the age that he was of 3, had moved to Rome, New York, in that term of the burgeoning early American Republic and the opening of what had been seen as the western frontier of New York became more and more settled and prosperous. So as a young boy, he really wanted to further his education. But as often would happen, families being unable to afford a higher education, uh, Jervis would go on. He'd work on his father's farm, but with the survey and then construction of the Erie Canal provided opportunities in which he would become an axeman and show great proficiency, which would lead him to be recognized, become a rodman, and engineers and surveyors, as part of those crews, would actually see in him great potential, offer him the opportunity. He asked the right questions, he engaged, and he was a quick learner. So that with that proficiency, it would lead to him advancing and becoming an engineer. As I mentioned before, about 1820s, he's an engineer on the canal with that section from the noses to the Schoharie Creek. And he would eventually become an engineer on other projects, other canal projects, such as the D&H Canal, the Shenango Canal. He was a chief engineer of the Shenango Canal. And projects such as the Croton Aqueduct that would supply water to New York City as a major hydrology project and water service, one of the major projects of that era, and other railroad projects that he would go on to be a part of. And like I said, he's one of the designers and the engineers responsible for the concept and the design of the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct that Otis Eddy would build for the Erie Canal to cross over the Schoharie Creek. So as that large enlargement of the Erie Canal develops, there's contract notices that are put out. So these notice for this contract was let out in not just New York State, but at this point, there is a canal fever across America. And there's several other engineers and contractors with this kind of experience. Again, Jervis would go on to work in other places in other canals and railroad projects, not just in New York, but be part of ones in Massachusetts and down toward the Potomac. So they would let out these contract notices in newspapers outside of New York. And this is one from Virginia in the Richmond Enquirer from 1838 as a contract notice to build, as part of the enlargement in here, it states that they're going to be building the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct. So they're looking for somebody to construct an aqueduct across the Schoharie Creek of about 600 feet in length and a section of canal adjoining the same. So they're going to be required to use materials and schematics by the state engineer. And they're looking for those proposals. Construction in 1839 is going to begin, and Otis Eddy has been awarded at that point in time the contract to build the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct. Although there is an economic recession happening in the late 1830s and the stop and tax law that's going to complicate the matter. It suspends many of those projects, and especially Canal Commission fund projects, and Eddy is instructed to complete the aqueduct according to that contract. The contract actually states that the aqueduct would need to be completed by October of 1840. So Eddy takes on additional or increased lines of credit to really push this project forward to complete it, while it is actually behind schedule by more than a year. It is completed by 1841, but Eddy does not receive immediate payment in full on his contract due to it being behind in schedule. It is overdue in its completion, but he is also stating that because he took out those additional lines of credit, he also needs an increase in the payment in order to pay off what he had accrued in interest on those lines of payment. The completed aqueduct would go into operation in 1845 as it was awaiting those other projects at the Jordan level that were kind of held up by that stop and tax law and the economic recession. It would take a great deal of political wrangling in order to complete those works, and actually between that period of time that it is completed in 1841, 1845, it's noted in several of the newspapers of the congressional acts in New York State, or that the politicians are demanding money to complete these projects, and particularly the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct, as it is already standing there and can be utilized. The timber trough that would actually hold the water for the Erie Canal to cross over has been placed on it. It is ready for operation. It just needs a few of those infrastructure, particularly toward Fultonville, lock completion to be able to go into operation. And that leads to an article, and I'm going to insert this. I found this as an interesting part of research, Man at the Pump. So it's quite a long article, and I'm just going to break it down essentially. And the other calls for statements toward bad management of the canal at that point in time, and calls for completion of those canal projects. But the Man at the Pump is an interesting one because it does go on in very language, I guess, of the 1840s, and kind of putting in the context of a story of the man at the pump who is pumping water onto the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct, although it is not in use, between 1841 and 1845 to keep water on there due to that timber trunk, or that timber trough that is going to need to be holding water for the Erie Canal. Basically, it's an indictment on the Canal Commission and the politicians that are in charge of it to get the works completed, as they have hired a man to simply stand there and pump water onto the aqueduct to ensure that that structure is maintained. There are other newspaper accounts later on to verify that they actually must have had somebody there, whether it was a daily operation or something, that the state was hiring somebody to keep water in that wooden trough on the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct, because there is newspaper articles stating that it may be a constitutional issue, as the Canal Commission fund is used for the construction, repairs, and operation of the canal, and not for maintenance of features that are not actually being used as part of the canal. So the payments that were going to whoever it was that was keeping water on the canal, I haven't discovered that name yet, or names of people that were operating that, that there was a constitutional issue on where the funding was coming from, and that that person may not be properly compensated for that work. But you get this during this period in time, the stop and tax law in the early 1840s in particular, where these projects are going on. There's a lot of calls of corruption and other mismanagement along the canal. And this actually kind of leads into, it'll build up again after the Civil War through the 1880s, these calls toward the canal being mismanaged. But at this era, this is a kind of a direct result of the Locofocos party kind of saying that we don't need this great expenditure, and that these basically they call for a reduction in banking and the waste of taxpayer money. It's a short-lived political party that's worth a little bit of a look into if you have the opportunity. And again, that's a constitutional question as to the completion and abandonment of the aqueduct, and the preserving of it versus the repair and otherwise operation toward that. So a little bit more about the man who received the contract. This is, again, the contract went to Otis Eddy to build the aqueduct. He had several Ithaca enterprises leading up to the era in which he would become a canal contractor. He had the Otis Eddy and Company paper production company. A lot of the creeks and water operations in the Ithaca area were enticing to industrious people such as Eddy. He would have a cotton mill, and in that cotton mill, there's a name you might be familiar with. He employed a young Ezra Cornell as a machinist. But because of the economic panic and the lead up to what would eventually be called the stop and tax law for the canal, that economic panic and recession of 1837 causes several of those enterprises and his cotton mill to close down. And that opens him up for the ability to bid in on a contract. The Schoharie Creek Aqueduct. And he would go on, unfortunately, to pass away in 1843, before the aqueduct to be able to go into use. And unfortunately, he hadn't been fully paid at that point in time, leaving his wife and son, Harriet Eddy, to go on and advocate for payment. And they would have to wrangle with New York State for quite a while in order to receive compensation. Otis Eddy's gravestone And again, they would wrangle for a while against the Canal Board and eventually receive some level of compensation. His legacy being the mentorship of Ezra Cornell, who would go on as part of several other projects. He was involved with Morse and the Telegraph, as well as establishment of Cornell University. There is actually the Eddy Gate, the area of Eddyville that became incorporated by the village of Ithaca as well. Eddy's son James would go on and become a prominent member of the business community and the American Telegraph Company. Would go on to be well known in that arena industry in the Ithaca area and the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct. Again, the Builder's Stone, this is the only one he was able to put his name on as far as any of these projects. It's an aqueduct that has this Builder's Stone, Otis Eddy, Builder, 1841. So by 1905, the Barge Canal Survey, which also becomes the basis for our Pathway to Empire exhibit model of the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct, is done. In 1916, they're going to canalize the Mohawk River, and the wooden trough is going to be removed. It no longer is going to need to carry the Erie Canal over the Schoharie Creek. It becomes an area of recreation, and in the early 1940s, removal of those eastern arches is going to be intentionally done to alleviate the flood potential of the Schoharie Creek and the ice jams on the piers of the aqueduct. It was something that was tolerated when the aqueduct was being used for the Erie Canal because of the resource and the infrastructure and the need for the aqueduct. But when it's no longer being used, and there are dams in the Mohawk River because of the Barge Canal, the flooding becomes precipitously worse, and those arches on that eastern end are removed intentionally. That's the deepest channel of the Schoharie Creek. Here's some views of that from above after those arches have been removed. 400 Canal Society forms sort of a reaction to the removal of those arches. When you start seeing the deterioration of your historic structures, it's a community-based grassroots effort. And they reach out, and the New York State Bureau of Preservation, Governor Rockefeller, creates a New York State Park in 1966, and the Erie Canal features at the site become nationally registered landmarks. In the late 1970s, there was a preservation effort. In the late 1990s, 2 more arches fall. There's a steel tenon cable system that is installed in the late 1970s to preserve the integrity and hold back sort of the weight of time on the aqueduct. But again, that fails in 1990. If you're there on site today, you can see actually as part of the remains some of those tendons, those steel cables that had failed. So we currently have 6 of the original 14 arches. It was 14 arches and 624 feet across the Schoharie Creek originally. And again, completed in 1841, operation 1845, and was used until 1916 to carry the Erie Canal over the Schoharie Creek. And that's part of the restoration project of the 1970s to hold the aqueduct in place. You can see that at that point in time, some of those stones, the heaving and the shifting. As I mentioned before about the original canal, the glacial till in the creek makes it very difficult, and that was one of Eddy's issues in constructing the aqueduct. And one of the reasons why it is actually a little bit more to the north is trying to find sure enough footings to be able to put the aqueduct in. So there was a realignment of the canal, shifting the aqueduct slightly to the north to find proper footings, and also to be able to use that port of the original Erie Canal to continue as a feeder further on the enlarged version of the canal. It's on the 7 to Save list, the 2018-2019 Preservation League of New York 7 to Save list, as we continue to advocate for the stabilization and preservation of the remains of the aqueduct. So that's a statewide advocacy group, and it is providing us with a new alliance committee that partners us even more with such organizations like the Erie Canal National Heritage Corps, the Preservation League, Canal Society of New York. Right here in Montgomery County, New York, the county is a full supporter of this project. Canal Corporation, New York State Canal Corporation, is also involved, and several other organizations, individuals, the Friends of Schoharie Crossing, and several advocates calling for the preservation of the structure. We're in the project phase of that in the sense that we have some grants that have been awarded, and we are working toward receiving more grants or otherwise funding the stabilization of the aqueduct for future generations. And here's a little bit more information about the Aqueduct Alliance. You can always reach out to the Friends of Schoharie Crossing or to the site, and we can provide you with more information if you are interested in having your name placed on the advocacy list. And this is an image of the model. Again, that 1905 survey was used to create a model inside the Pathway to Empire exhibit. It helps us illustrate how the aqueduct was used, that partially designed by John B. Jervis aqueduct that carried the Erie Canal over the Schoharie Creek. And while at times it might feel, because of those remains, that the sun is sort of setting on that part of history, we feel that it's sort of a new era. We can look at the remains of the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct in a very romanticized way. If you're familiar with Thomas Cole and the Rise and Fall of Empire, you kind of see that nature does, it finds a way. We're keeping back some of the growth on the aqueduct. We want to preserve that and provide it as a fantastic way to interpret and to tell the history of the Erie Canal, of engineering in early America, the individuals involved, people like Otis Eddy or John B. Jervis, and the countless other names and the laborers for the Erie Canal, and how the Erie Canal really was. It was an infrastructure project, not without its naysayers, but that kind of galvanized New York, the original canal, and even parts of the enlargement and the barge canal, as a way to say, we are interested in and invested in our future. So let us build these canals, let us build this infrastructure, and create a better tomorrow, one of economic prosperity, of cultural changes, societal changes, that we can hopefully be proud of. So when we look at the remains of the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct, I don't just see the past, I don't just see the history of its operation, I see the future and the potential for places like Schoharie Crossing and other canal locations across New York in particular. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for this presentation. This was a mashup of a couple of our smaller online presentations and outreach programs, specifically done for the John B. Jervis Library in Rome, New York. I really do appreciate the opportunity to present this to the library. And again, my name is David Brooks. I'm the educator at Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. Up on the screen is some contact information. You can reach out to us at schohariecrossing@parks.ny.gov. Our phone number is 518-829-7516. We are a New York State Park and Historic Site located in Fort Hunter, New York, Montgomery County, where the Schoharie Crossing is the crossing of the original Erie Canal and the enlarged Erie Canal. It's where the Schoharie Creek meets the Mohawk River. We are adjacent to the Barge Canal. There's a wonderful opportunity to come out, explore our miles of towpath trail and other great amenities and features, boat launch area, picnic areas, the Pathway to Empire exhibit in our visitor center, as well as the historic features along the site. Schoharie Creek Aqueduct being the largest of those features. We have the East Guard Lock, Lock 20 from the original canal, about a half mile of original Clinton's Ditch that would be used as a feeder canal later on. Empire Lock, that is lock number 29. Yankee Hill Lock, lock 28, and the Putnam Canal Store on the banks of the Mohawk River. There is also the section around the aqueduct that was Lock 30 and Brown's Cash Store that we interpret. So I hope that you get an opportunity when the weather is nice to come out and explore the site. Hopefully the visitor center will be open. We're going to be opening that up hopefully very soon by reservations. You can always contact us for more information. Whether you come out in 2020 or you wait until 2021, we'd love to see you there on site. Let us know that you visited. Let us know what you think of the site. And again, thank you so much for joining us for this presentation. Thank you so much to the Jervis Library for giving us this opportunity to tell you a little bit about Jervis's involvement with the surveying, the dam, and the aqueduct. And again, we hope to see you there on site. Take care, be well,